Well, throughout the city's history, here in Leeds, we've had so many great writers, and that tradition still continues to this day. And I'm joined by one of them right now, Chris Nickson, who I'm giving the grand title that he's chuckling at mildly of a great writer. Chris, it's fantastic to have you speaking to us today.
Here.
Chris, you're a Leeds writer. You're Leeds born and bred. You grew up here as a young man. Tell me what the first experience was like for you when you first picked up the pen and, as a Leeds lad, knew that you could write.
Well, I was 11, and it was just an essay at school. 3 paragraphs, tell a story in 3 paragraphs. And I did, and it was just like a light bulb moment. It was kind of, wait a minute, I can do this. And from then on, I was kind of hooked. My father was a writer.
Right.
He'd had a couple of television plays on in the late 60s, early 70s. So there was that, but I stayed with it. Well, I stayed with it ever since, but more on and off for a long time. And then probably from the age of 40, just continually, it's been my living.
Yeah, because so you grew up in Leeds, then went off to university, was here for a short period of time after that, but then you moved, and we can somewhat, I think, pick up a trace of an accent that's changed over the years. You moved to Seattle.
Well, I moved to America for 30 years, and 20 of those were in Seattle,
Right.
10 in the Midwest first. So, yeah, that lingers a little bit.
Yeah,
Particularly from the Midwest, where I had to alter my accent so they could understand me.
Makes sense of you.
Yeah, pretty much. And then I moved back to England 9 years ago and moved back to Leeds last year.
States. Just recently, just a few years ago, you came back to the UK, and only just a year ago you've come back to Leeds. How much has the city changed from your memories of it back in the 80s?
Oh, hugely. I was still coming back pretty much every year to see my parents, so I did see the changes, but from, let's say 93, 94, changes have been massive. Back then, there were so many empty shops on Briggate, it just looked like the city was going to close down. And then around 96, there was this regeneration. Suddenly there was a whole lot of life about the place again. And now it's this thriving centre. Unfortunately, a lot of that is generated by retail. But even that has its history here. For instance, where Trinity is now, pretty much was the site of one of the first department stores in the country, called the Grand Pygmalion, which opened back in 1884. A 4-story, huge department store. They had 200 shop assistants who worked there. So you have little corners of the city that have this history associated with different things. Like that's, the retail area.
Yeah.
But it's good to see it thriving so much. And there's a wonderful art scene here now, good music scene. The city's really come alive again.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you mean about the history of retail in the city, because I think in some ways Leeds is a city that has always thrived on retail and on the fundamentals of selling goods and selling products. We've, as a city, we started off as a market on a bridge, and then from then on we've had great national institutions. I say great national institutions, I'm thinking maybe Asda and Marks and Spencer's, some big names that have started in this very city. But do you think it's to the detriment of the more cultural side of the city or the artistic side of the city that so much emphasis seems to go towards retail?
I think it's to the detriment of manufacturing. This city made its money on clothing. Not just, originally on the wool trade itself, the market, which started on the bridge and then was twice a week on Briggate, and then they built the cloth hall, and that was when the money really started rolling in. And then you had people like Burton's and all the other big names from the late 19th, early 20th century who were producing suits, and this first mass production of clothing for men. And now we've lost all that manufacturing, and it's been eclipsed by retail. And for me, I'm not sure that's a good thing. For instance, I'm very much against the whole idea of Victoria Gate. We've decimated part of the city's history on Eastgate to accommodate what people like to call aspirational shopping.
There's a few people who'd argue we've knocked down Hoagie's, which had a pretty poor reputation for some people. Have we just knocked down?
It's that whole sweep of buildings. Yeah. I mean, in some ways it's inevitable, but the city hasn't been kind to its cultural heritage. You know, back in the 90s, there was a movement they were going to knock down the market. I mean, for God's sake, that's one of the Leeds icons. And if you go back, there's a lot of Victorian buildings here, but go back to pre-Victorian era and you're hard-pressed to find much of Leeds history around. Most of it is pubs.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a sad comment, really.
Yeah. So tell me about, in your work, your novels that have been set in and around Leeds, how much does the history of Leeds as a city and various parts of it, various buildings even, how much does that feed into the novels that you've written?
Oh, quite a lot, because for me Leeds is very much a character in itself in the books. In my Richard Nottingham series, which is set in the 1730s, the cloth market features very heavily, regularly, because that was so important. And it's when you had the first real delineation between the rich and the poor in the city. The merchants who ran the corporation were the rich, and everyone else was pretty much desperately poor. And then my newest book, Gods of Gold, which is set in the 1890s, has very different signifiers to it. One of the places that features is the old Victoria pub at the bottom of Roundhay Road, which no longer exists. And that has a personal connection for me because my great-grandfather was the landlord there a little later. But it's a very different industrial Leeds, and that's the landscape I've tried to put across. A lot of back-to-back houses. The second book in the series, which is coming out next year, called Two Bronze Pennies, a lot of it takes place in the Leylands, which was just north of the city centre, and largely became, for want of a better term, the Jewish ghetto after the refugees who came here. And a story set there has to me quite deliberate parallels in the modern world, because we took refugees then, and yes, there was prejudice against them. And now we're back with, because of certain political parties, a lot of prejudice against refugees, and we're seeing them not victimized, but demonized. And the first book, Gods of Gold, is set against the 1890 gas strike, when the corporation tried to rewrite the contract for the workers so they'd make a lot less money and a lot of them would be laid off. And I just saw parallels between that and the way the countries run, the bosses run it these days. Difference is that the workers won.
So we have Gods of Gold here.
Yeah.
Tom Harper mystery. What else do we have here? What else is part of the series?
6 Richard Nottingham story books.
Cold Cruel Winter as well.
Yeah.
So tell me about what is the gist of the series? How do the Nottingham mysteries come together?
Well, it wasn't originally meant to be a series. It was just one book, The Broken Token, and that was published. And the publisher said, "Right, what are you going to do next?" And I thought, what am I going to do next? And there's a story in the papers, actually a lead story. Someone found an old book on the street, handed it in to the police, and they looked at it and determined that the book had been bound in human skin. I thought, okay, there's a story there. And that's part of Cold Cruel Winter. And as much as the mysteries themselves, it's the relationships and the growing relationships between the central characters and their families that's important to me. In some ways, perhaps even more important than the mysteries, because ultimately you're writing a novel, it's about people. And if the reader's not interested in the people, then they're going to put the book down. And people, by their nature, grow and change over time.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me, what are you, now that you're back as a Leeds writer, very much firmly in the city again, what are you working on now?
I have a book coming out in January set in Leeds in the 1950s. It's very much a sort of noir novel. Then the second in the Tom Harper series, Two Bronze Pennies, comes out in April. I'm working on the third in that series right now. And then middle of next year, with a little local press, Armley Press, a book of short stories. It's kind of collected short stories, but half of it will be telling the history of Leeds in short stories.
Okay. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing them when they come along over the next few months. Chris,
Yeah.
it's very nice to meet you. Very nice to have you here.
Thanks for
on the
having me,
Bucket List.
Mark.
Thank you.